Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm your host, Brian Keane, best-selling author of the book, The Fitness Mindset and Rewire Your Mindset, here to help you by deconstructing expert guests on all things health, fitness and mindset. Today's guest is on the high end of expert guests. Today's guest is Tim Spector. Tim is Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at King's College London and is an expert when it comes to the gut microbiome and gut health. Today's episode, we dive deep into his new book, Spoon-Fed, Why Almost Everything We've Been Told About Food is Wrong. And this is a very enjoyable book and a very eye-opening book for those of you who may not have questioned some of the traditional quote-unquote wisdom when it comes to food guidelines, food labels, and nutrition in general. So today's episode, we dive in and out of a lot of different topics, focusing on gut health, focusing on the myths around diets, and just overall health in general. So when it comes to how to consume today's episode, it is a start to finish. Probably have a pencil and a pen to make some notes as you go along, and Tim gives you a lot of practical tips and a lot of practical guidelines to consider when it comes to how you approach nutrition. Some of the things we talk about, the diet myth, and if you look after your gut will look after you. The most unsupportive myth for people when it comes to fat or weight loss goals, the optimal diet and lifestyle to optimize your gut health, what to look out for when choosing fish, meat and plants to eat, and why you can't exercise or out-exercise a bad diet, and the importance of gut microbes for weight loss, fat loss, and just your overall well-being. I got so much from today's episode. I'm definitely going back over with a notepad and pen. I listened to Spoon-Fed in preparation for this podcast, and as I said, it's a very eye-opening book for anyone that hasn't questioned some of the traditional nutritional guidelines that you may have either been brought up to believe or have been fed from traditional media online, or in today's case, social media online. So we're cutting through a lot of the noise in today's episode, the myths, the misconceptions when it comes to food, and talking about why everything or almost everything we've been told about food is wrong. So that is the title of today's episode with expert guest Tim Spector. Enjoy. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined with my guest, Tim Spector. Tim is Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at King's College London. He has won several academic awards and published over 700 academic papers, a large proportion of which directly relate to nutrition and cases of obesity. Since 2011, he has been leading the largest microbiome project in the UK, using genetic sequencing to study the bacteria in the guts of 5,000 twins. He is the lead investigator of British Gut, the UK's largest open source science project to understand microbial diversity of the human gut. And he is a prolific writer with several popular science and diet books, the most recent of which will be the focus of today's conversation. That book is called Spoon-Fed, Why Almost Everything We've Been Told About Food is Wrong. I've just finished the audiobook version myself, and I'm really looking forward to talking all things food, nutrition and diet in today's episode. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
It's good to be on.
Tim, we were saying just before we went on air, when I was listening to the audiobook, which I loved, I was making notes as I went along, and I had to stop at chapter 7 or 8 because there's so much value in here, and you're breaking down misconceptions and myths just chapter by chapter by chapter. But before we dive into the book, can you tell us a little bit about your backstory and kind of what got you down the path to focusing on, say, the human gut and the gut microbiome?
Yeah, well, it started about 28 years ago when I set up the UK Twin Registry, and we've been studying about 14,000 identical and non-identical twins in the UK and Ireland since that time. And most of that time was looking at genetics and looking about how amazingly similar identical twins were. But then I started the last sort of 10 years getting really interested in why even identical twins often died of different diseases. They would have different rates of depression, different rates of obesity, and often different personalities. And so I was interested in what could make genetic clones different. And it basically boiled down to a few things that I started ticking off the list. And the one that I could never tick off the list was the gut microbes, because even in identical twins, they're usually very different. And that really started me thinking to say, well, if that's what makes the difference between disease and non-disease in genetic clones, maybe this could affect all of us. And so I started putting this together, and that's really when I went away and researched about 10 years ago the first book on the topic with the diet myth, which really explored the gut microbes and their link with food and nutrition. And then in a way, eventually that led to Spoon-Fed, which was a wider view of how come we've got it all so wrong and how we've been misled, by the food industry, by our culture, by our oversimplification of nutrition, if you like. And so really my research and my book writing has now gone in this direction, which is all around focusing on gut health and personalized nutrition. And so it's really opened up the whole area of nutrition, which from being regarded as probably the most boring area in science is probably the most exciting.
That's one of my favorite things about the way you open this book. It hooked me from the very start, because I think it's after the introduction, I think it's chapter 1 it's personal, which is talking about personalized nutrition. Can you expand a little bit on that? Because as somebody that has a background in nutrition and will consume diet books until the cows come home, I loved the way you introduced this. And I think there's so many people who have a misconception about diets out there, about different foods, etc., that we'll start to break down today for sure, because it's the basis of the book. But talk to us first about personalized nutrition.
Yeah, I think, I started to get angry at the idea there were these guidelines that some set of experts had set, and these were a blueprint about how all of us should eat, and that if we did this, we'd all be healthy and live happily ever after and never put on a pound in weight. And clearly this just wasn't true. Talking to my patients and just seeing everyone around, what suited one person just didn't suit another. So that was the thing that really sort of got me angry. And the US and the UK and also Irish guidelines have been following this sort of dogma that they don't want to change. That it's all about cutting down on fat and eating more starchy vegetables, and it turns out that actually we think there's this huge consensus behind these guidelines, but we realize that not only people like myself don't really believe there's a consensus, but we asked 13 professors of nutrition in the UK and the US to rank 100 common foods, and it turns out they could rank 50 of them pretty much identically about whether they're healthy or not healthy, but the other 50 they couldn't at all. And these are all the areas of big contention, like diet drinks, like dairy products, like lean cuts of meat, like dried fruits, and things with low calorie or low fat content, yogurts and things like this. So there's much more uncertainty than we've been told, and a lot of this is because we've done all our nutrition research in the past, A, on small numbers, and B, assuming that everyone is average. And so all the results we've had to date, whether it's how many calories you need to how much fat you need to how many vitamins you need, is all done on some mythical average person that really just doesn't exist. And we've done the studies now to actually prove this and realize that every individual's result is the result you need to look at, not squashing them together to get a fake average.
When you mention things that anger you, I'm very curious, as the book breaks down so many myths and misconceptions, and there's a lot of things that I think is very eye-opening for people, because I highly recommend anyone listening to this go get the physical book or check out the audiobook, because it'll open up your eyes on a lot of things. What is, say, your biggest pet peeve, Tim, when it comes to nutritional guidelines or to some of the recommendations that are generally given as a quote unquote best practice, for that non-existent average person that you mentioned? What's the biggest one, or do you have one or two in particular that really irk you, that are particular angry topics when somebody brings up in conversation or that you see in online capacity? What jumps to mind when I say that?
I guess the thing that makes me angriest is when people talk about the calorie. And we get quoted this stuff that, oh, it's a mathematical formula, you can't change it, a calorie in is a calorie out, and that it's, losing weight or gaining weight is simply a question of balancing your calories in and calories out. And a calorie in one food is the same as a calorie in another. And this is absolute nonsense. And we've been hiding behind the calorie as a unifying number that, the public believe is a way of, in a way, assigning the quality of a food to. When they go to a supermarket or whatever, they say, oh, it's, 300 calories or whatever it is. And that's the thing that they look at. And that's the thing that the food manufacturers want you to look at. And it's just a complete con. It's not that calories don't exist. Of course they do. There's obviously a difference between eating, a pile of spinach and a pile of chips, and they differ in calories. But the idea that you can measure it precisely, that you can calorie count is an effective way of losing weight, and the fact that we're told by the diet industry and even our watches, our Fitbits or whatever, how many calories we've burnt, so therefore people can say, okay, I can now have another 250 calories today and I'll be fine. Most people will know by now that experience is wrong, that the two things don't add up. We can't measure precisely how people burn calories, and which even worse than we can measure how much calories you put into your body. So the whole thing that women should have 2,000 calories and men 2,500 calories is based on very crude averages and ignoring all the latest science about how our body uses different foods differently, even if they have the same calories. And there's a couple of good examples that are our latest research. And one is the fact that you get two types of food and they can be equal in calories, one junk food, one whole foods, and they have the same appetite. Well, they have the same appetizing feel, so people say they quite like them in a buffet, but in randomized trials, people will eat more of the ultra-processed food than they will of the whole foods. So the effect of that calorie, because it has lots of these other chemicals that make you eat more, is to make you gain weight. And the other fact that's become clear is when we can discuss more about this when we did these giant predict studies, but we gave everybody, thousands of people, identical muffins. And these are high-fat, high-sugary muffins. They give you a big sugar peak. Now, 1 in 4 people eating these actually had a sugar peak and then a sugar dip. They didn't know that, but they were wearing these glucose monitors. And it turns out that those people who had the sugar dip, this 1 in 4, were much hungrier 3 hours later, and they ate much more over the next 24 hours than people who didn't have a sugar dip. So clearly the idea that it's only about the calorie in the food is just pure nonsense. And this is really, I think, the keystone myth that we need to dismantle in order to get to the other ones, like diet drinks or fat in our foods or this oversimplification of nutrition, because the calorie is the perfect one for food manufacturers to sell us rubbish food. And they've done that in collaboration with a vacuum in the nutrition research world, because there just isn't, until very recently, haven't been enough studies. All the studies done on about 10 people, who are usually students attending the nutrition course in the university. And we've based all our decisions affecting millions of people's lives on this really old-fashioned, poor quality research.
One of the things that really connected with me personally was, as someone obviously with the, as I mentioned, the nutrition background, I would always think of like the genetic history of people. But just as you mentioned there, the study on the muffins, one of the things that opened up my eyes when I listened to your book was taking the gut microbes into account, that how you process foods, how your body is going to take in those calories, there's a huge element of the gut microbes that you have that are going to play a role in that. And I think that spin really got me thinking about, I've really been limiting my thinking when it comes to even myself with calories and the way I look at it. So I just wanted to kind of pull that out because it's something I got personally. But I'm very curious, Tim, as somebody that has read many nutritional books, and I think this is one that there's so many people listening who will get a huge benefit from just educating themselves that this is how food is marketed, this is how food is branded, these are the misconceptions and myths around it. But when you started writing Spoon-Fed, more so than even the diet myth, which I know focused more on kind of the gut microbe side of things, what was the section or what was the chapter or what was the part of the book that made you think this needs to be an entire book? And I ask that as somebody that when I'm interviewing guests who have written books that are as impactful as yours, there was normally some thread or particular area that they wanted to cover that made them think this is a full book. Was there any section in your book that did that, or was it a case that you have so many years of experience that you wanted to cover it from A to Z? What was your process on why you wrote Spoon-Fed? What was the kind of thread that allowed you pull on it so that you could actually get this information out there to people?
Well, I think that it was a logical follow-on because diet myth for me was important because it basically introduced people to a whole new organ in our bodies that was absolutely key to how we process food and how it, as a concept of a way of eating, we could just say, okay, keep your microbes happy and the rest will follow as a very broad concept. But on that journey, I'd picked up all these stories that made people resistant to that message because there'd been so much of our culture has been drummed into these stories about how we should eat food and what is a good diet and this is bad because it's got fat. And it was really understanding how we've been misled for so long and how, in a way, what the role of the food companies was in that as well, because they're the ones who've benefited as each time we've made mistakes, they have latched onto it and produced a food that's cheaper for them to make that ticks those boxes that make us think we're getting healthier while we're actually getting less healthy. So to me, it was trying to get people to first realize the microbiome is absolutely crucial. Second, giving people the knowledge that they need to know more about food so they can't be fooled by these old wives' tales that are, marketing keeps propagating, and to some extent governments, because, there is a clear link between the big food companies and what the governments are telling us and how our food is priced, so that the cheap rubbish food is the cheapest and unfortunately relatively continues to get cheaper compared to good food. So I think they were the ones. But there was also another thing to the book which could have been separate, which is all about personalized nutrition and how we are all unique. And I think that they're the two real themes for me that made important. But each of these myths, you could take, like skipping breakfast or exercise, or we love a simple answer. And so it's deconstructing that simple solution, because nutrition is far from simple. It's actually an incredibly complex science that has been dumbed down for too long. And humans love a simple answer, and we're suckers for someone who offers that magic solution, that instant supplement, or that food, or this perfect protein snack, or whatever it is. When actually we need to all understand much more about it. So I think one aim of the book is to get people sufficiently interested that they can, keep educating themselves and educate other people and get our children educated.
Yeah, I I completely agree with that. That black and white thinking when it comes to nutrition in a topic that's so grey is one of my biggest pet peeves when I'm scrolling through social media. When you see a one size fits all, this is what everybody should be doing, everyone should be gluten free, or everybody should be vegan, or everybody should be this, that or the other, when, as you said, there's so much personalised context that needs to be considered. What, from your experience, Tim, from kind of your expert lens, what's the most unsupportive myth that you see out there when it comes to, say, fat loss or weight loss in particular?
I think that the obvious one is that exercise actually is a really good way of losing weight. And this still gets propagated. And I'm a big fan of exercise. I exercise regularly, and it's great for your heart. It probably reduces cancer risk. It does all kinds of things, very good for, your mental state. But the idea that, the average amateur doing a few hours a week helps them lose weight is complete nonsense, and actually probably very harmful, and only really helps, calorie counting and these ideas that you can sort of quantify exercise. And if you've burnt off 300 calories on your cycle on the gym, you can go and, drink 2 glasses of wine or beer. So I think that's probably, the other big one that gets a lot of kickback, because I think people just like a lot of my myth busting if they have a personal interest in it, whether it's vitamins, whether it's, selling fish, whether it's they love breakfast. Everyone's got some things that they irrationally hold a belief in. But I think it would help people if we did believe that, you can't run off a bad diet, and that we have to separate these two out. It's not just a question of burning off a few extra calories through exercise that's going to get you healthier. You really have to change your diet at the same time. So that's probably the main one. But I'm sure I can find plenty of others.
You've definitely hit on one there that jumped out at me. One of the things I try and do when I read any nutritional book is always come in with kind of an open mind in terms of, regardless of whether I agree or disagree with the information. And one of the sections in there, as someone that's such a fish lover, was the section on how fish isn't as good as we think it is. And I knew that it was one of those that you kind of want something to disconfirm your belief that it's not as good as we think. But talk through the misconception that fish, and maybe even tie in meat in there, because I think you put the two of them together very well. That I think it's bringing back the bacon. It was something to do with bacon was the name of the chapter, and then definitely fishy business was the fish chapter that jumped at me. Talk a little bit around the myth or the misconception that we should be avoiding meat and we should be eating fish, or just your kind of thoughts on that, because there's a lot of people listening and that will be their default school of thought, because that's what we've been told for years.
Well, up to a couple of years ago, I thought exactly that as well, that we should be swapping out meat for fish, and we'd be much healthier, and this is going to help the planet. And when I got into it, I think it all comes down to, well, what meat and what fish. And so the question of quality comes up, which is never really discussed, because virtually all the evidence that meat is bad for us comes from processed meats, eating large amounts of highly processed meats. The evidence that eating small amounts of good quality meat is bad for us is there's hardly any of it, really. So again, it all does come down to context and presumably what you would swap your meat for. And again, this is the other recurring problem in nutrition, is people talk about one food item, but they don't talk about, well, what are you going to eat instead? The reason that the low fat debacle of the last 30 years is because people actually swapped fats for refined carbs, and that was a low fat meal, but actually was worse for our sugars, and therefore we got fat. So it's all like what you replace it with, and that's never been part of this discussion, really. So replacing it with fish sounds great, but then you look at all that data and you think, well, isn't it fantastic? It should be fantastic for your heart, and these omega-3s are great for your brain. You actually look at the data, at most, we're talking about 5 to 10% benefit in most studies, which is, for these observational studies, is not really significant. So there's no evidence that fish itself is harmful, but there's really not much evidence that it's a real positive effect, which is really annoying because I'm like you. I love fish, and I go to restaurants, and I've been thinking I'm virtuous and eating lots of it. So I think we may have to start selecting this fish, because the other thing is 60% of the fish we eat now is farmed, and that is really A, bad for the environment, B, probably contains chemicals and antibiotics and all kinds of other stuff we don't want to know about. And increasingly, fish now contains bits of microplastics and stuff from the other shit we're throwing in the oceans, which ain't good either. So I think we shouldn't use these broad terms. We should start thinking about, how do I have the best quality meats and the best quality fish, and start separating out these categories and not treat them all the same. There's obviously a big difference between eating lots of processed fish fingers and having some fabulous mussels caught in the sea in a perfectly natural environment, or for buying your prawns from a fish farm in Thailand that's destroyed massive forests and uses other fish to feed them. So that changed my mind about fish. So I still eat fish, but I don't think I'd be recommending everyone should have 3 portions of fish a week, because we'd run out of anything in our seas very quickly. But also, there's no clear evidence it's really good for you or makes you brainy, as my mum told me.
You mentioned the antibiotics in fish that's farmed, and as someone with obviously the knowledge you have with the gut microbiome, I'm very curious, because I know there's a chapter in the book on vitamins, and I do want to segue into that. But what are your thoughts on, say, probiotics, and then looking after your gut health and hedging your bet with a probiotic, more so than specifically vitamins, which we'll get into next? I'm just curious, what's your kind of thoughts and opinions on that?
Well, I'm absolutely for probiotics in food, so natural probiotics. So here we're talking about fermented foods, we're talking about high quality yogurt, what I call the K rations, the 4 Ks, kefir, kimchi, kombucha, and kraut. And having these as part of your daily diet, even a small amount, I think has now a good evidence base that it's likely to be good for you. And if you compare that to some of the randomized trials of actual probiotic supplements, again, the vast majority of those trials do show some benefit in about 18 different diseases. The reason I prefer food probiotics, fermented foods, to supplement probiotics is that they generally give you a wider range of microbe in them. So things like kombucha or kefir can have up to 30 different types of microbe, fungi and bacteria, which means that you're enriching your species in your gut, whereas probiotic supplements often only have 1 to 3 types of bacteria. And as we all have a unique set of our own gut microbes, we don't know if they're necessarily going to work for us. So that's the state of where we are at the moment. I think it is an evolving field, so hopefully we will be able to, in a way, personalize probiotic supplements in the same way that we're now starting to personalize foods. And I think that's very much going to be with us in the next 5 years. But at the moment, I like have my probiotics in a smelly bit of cheese that's unpasteurized rather than in some packet from the chemist.
On top of the foods you mentioned there, in terms of getting your probiotics from foods, what other kind of major tip would you say for someone that's looking to optimize their gut health? Is that obviously the introduction of those foods when it comes to somebody that, and I know you talk about this in the diet myth, that in order to, lose body fat, lose weight, etc., and just optimize everything, you need to look after your gut. What are kind of the main things you see or mistakes that people make when it comes to trying to optimize their gut? Is it certain foods that they're consistently eating? Is it not an overall look at their nutrition in general? Is it, a lack of those foods, or is it a combination? What do you generally see, Tim? Because I'm sure you get this all the time based on your level of expertise with the gut microbiome. What's the kind of the main mistakes people are making when their goal is to optimize their gut, but they're just not doing it?
The main focus should be on increasing the diversity of species. So we're told often there's one easy cure, and you need this particular probiotic, or you should only eat this type of cabbage, or whatever it is, or Jerusalem artichoke, or whatever. Or a kale smoothie. But the idea really is that the concept is you've got these trillions of microbes, perhaps several hundred or 1,000 different species. You want to get more species and more strains so that those guys produce a wider range of chemicals. They're basically chemical factories. So if you have that mindset, so how can I best keep my garden or my zoo as well stocked with different species as possible, then you start to understand how you can help your gut. And the way to do that is we've looked at thousands of people, and the people who have the best diversity are eating 30 different types of plant a week, and that includes nuts, seeds, and herbs. So it's not just different types of kale. And the other thing is that you pick foods that are high in polyphenols. These are the defense chemicals like resveratrol, but there are thousands of them, and these occur in strongly tasting and brightly colored foods like berries, like nuts, like olive oil, like dark chocolate, like red wine. And you always pick leaves of lettuce and things that are dark colored. Then the other thing is to, as well as the fermented foods, you really want to avoid ultra processed foods. And that includes things with emulsifiers and artificial sweeteners, things that your microbes aren't used to encountering. And the other thing, finally, is don't snack. Try and have long fasting intervals to rest your microbes. And so if you generally do that, and this means eating a predominantly plant-based diet, you can have meat or fish, but as long as you achieve those rules, then most people will improve their gut microbes, and they'll be able to stabilize their weight and reduce the number of infections, immunity, and all these things will be improved. So that is a one size fits all guideline. But I found because we all have different microbes to start with, it's the one that works best.
I definitely want to ask you this question more of a kind of a personal standpoint, just because, as you said, from everyone listening, they can see how well schooled you are in your area, the amount of academic papers you put out, the books, the speaking, everything that you do. I'm curious, Tim, over the last, say, 5 years, I know there's been a huge change in our knowledge on the gut, even the last 5-10 years. What was the most interesting thing for you that you discovered, either firsthand through your own studies or secondhand through observation or through something else? What was, when it came to, wow, we had no idea about this when it came to the gut, what was the thing that got you really excited about it? Or what was the thing that really jumped out at you over the last 5, 6, 7 years that you think is going to be revolutionary? Or is, again, we're starting to adopt it in the mainstream now, things like your book, the information you're putting out there. But for you personally, what was the thing that got you really excited when it came to gut research over the last few years?
Well, I'd say the original excitement probably came about 8 years ago, when we did a twin study on the microbes and first showed not much in the way of genetic similarity of the microbes, and that identical twins were often different. So that was very important for me as a geneticist, to say that I can't blame the genes for this. And the other was that we found that when we looked at identical twins where one was overweight, the other one was skinny, we nearly always found the skinny one had more diverse range of microbes, so the gut health was better. And they nearly always had microbes that were friendly, so they had increased levels of protective microbes. And this, we looked at a couple of these, and when we put some of these microbes like Akkermansia crispinella into mouse models, we could stop them getting fat. And that really was a bit of an aha moment, because suddenly you take what's you're observing in humans and you can see, well, you can see how you could make this into a treatment. And if you could get all those protective microbes boosted in individuals naturally, it would be an incredible treatment for pretty much everyone in the world. And that research has carried on, so that we've just published in the journal Nature Medicine last month a paper showing that we found 15 good and 15 bad microbes that occur in pretty much all populations that you can manipulate with food. So for the first time, we've now made this link between the microbes in your gut, the food that feeds them up or down, and whether the health side of it, so whether they give you heart disease or obesity or diabetes. And so that link is really what has made, for me, the fact that food is medicine suddenly a real rather than just an abstract term.
That's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to ask definitely a dummy question now, so I apologize, but that's so interesting about the twins and one being skinny, one being overweight. Would that suggest then, as you mentioned, it's not hereditary genetic, it's lifestyle based, that if their microbes were so different that there's not a genetic component to it? Was that the reason that one would be skinny and the other would be overweight, down to dietary choices, lifestyle in general? Is that what caused that difference?
Yes, when you take identical twins, which are genetic clones, and you see there's a difference between them, you know that can't be due to genetics, because they have identical genes in every cell in their body. So in a way, that is a very powerful test. And I think for me, that was a turning point, particularly as a geneticist who's been brought up and been telling people that how important genes were, and how, when it comes to being overweight or having health problems, your genes are paramount. Suddenly, I could say, actually, in how we respond to food and our gut health, genes are not paramount. You can change them by changing your diet, and you can do that very quickly. So that is the most important message, and it's a very powerful, optimistic message for people, because many of the, people who suffer from these problems have been told, oh, well, blame your parents, there's not much you can do about it. You can try your best, but you're never going to fight your genes.
You mentioned there that obviously with your background, that was the kind of the lens in which you saw things, and then these tests and new studies obviously proved otherwise, and you were able to change your opinion based on new information given. And I love that. I think that approach, it's the scientific approach 101, but you very clearly put it across in books and other podcasts that I've listened to you on. But in the last year or 18 months, Tim, is there anything that you've changed your mind about? I know that you're constantly, and this goes through the book where you're talking about, the example of enjoying fish, and then you change your mind about it, and you've given several examples in the book. I'm curious, just as someone that's constantly staying on top of your knowledge and updating your information, in the last 12, 18 months, is there anything that jumps to mind that you've really changed your mind about based on new research, based on new studies, or even based on anecdotal experience? Does anything come to mind when I say that?
Salt comes to mind because up to 2 years ago, I thought it was pretty obvious that adding too much salt to your food was bad for your blood pressure, and if you had high blood pressure, you should be on a restricted salt diet. I had some blood pressure problems and tried salt restriction, and it didn't work for me. And studies coming out only in the last 1 to 2 years have suddenly said that people who are on tough salt restrictions actually have more metabolic problems, get more problems of kidney problems and diabetes and kidney conditions. And it didn't really stop them getting heart disease or strokes, which was what it was supposed to do. And the average person, like myself, with a bit of mild high blood pressure, would only gain about 1% in terms of lowering blood pressure. So suddenly this fantastic pleasure of eating properly seasoned food and cutting that out didn't make any sense to me at all. Whereas before I'd been quite a convert to this generally accepted advice that you should salt restrict if you've got a problem like that. So we do need to keep reevaluating these stories and not just believe the old epidemiology studies, which were often flawed or difficult, particularly in this area of nutrition, where a lot of people have very, very fixed views, and a lot of academics have stayed in the same subject for 20, 30 years and only get grants and celebrity, really, if they keep repeating the same thing. So I think that's very important for people to understand. It's very hard for some of these people to change their minds as they do in other areas of science.
You have a great quote in the book. I can't remember, was it to do with coffee or if it was to do with something, it might have been supplements that you talked about. It was great for, getting pats on the back, great for your career, but not very good for your health. I can't remember which study you were talking about.
No, I wrote a book on, I wrote my first paper about how drinking coffee gave you cancer. And that really launched my career as an epidemiologist, because I did it very young as a medical student. And once you get a sensational result like that, it's great, but most of them turn out to be false. And it's really important to realize that a lot of the stuff I was writing and others are writing, old-fashioned observational epidemiology that we're seeing with COVID, for example, may not be true at all. And that we have to balance, truth against your career. And I'm old enough now and senior enough. I can admit all my mistakes. I don't mind, if I've got over 900 papers, if I say that a few of them are wrong.
And I think it's very important for people to come at it with that lens, because I know you've mentioned walnuts is the one that comes up over and over again about like all the myth busting things on walnuts in terms of studies. But coffee came to mind there. I couldn't remember if it was on coffee that great for your career. And I think for everybody that's consuming that information online, seeing studies in newspapers or magazines or social media, realize that, it may not stand, in most cases generally doesn't stand the test of time, but it gets, that message out there for the person that did the paper or for the whoever it is.
And the journalist as well. Let's not forget the journalists. They love a coffee is deadly headline as well. And we're a sucker for that. So we've just got to bear with a pinch of salt and realize for every headline like that, what about the other 20 papers that have been done on the same subject that might be negative?
It's so true. Tim, I just have two final questions. One is, I know that you put out a lot of stuff on Instagram that's been growing massively since you've been doing more interviews and since the last book in particular, since Spoonfed. But if you had access to everybody that has a goal of health or weight loss, and you could put up a post on Instagram that was either breaking down a myth, breaking down a misconception, or was just a message you wanted to share with the world, what would you say or what would you post that could get out there to everybody that has that weight loss goal or even just a health goal? If you had access to everybody on Instagram, what would you say?
Oh, it's a tough one. I think it would be, firstly, realize that you're all unique and that you need to experiment yourself to work out what foods are best for you, but at the same time realize that you have to look after your gut microbes. And if you feed them right, they will look after you for the rest of your life. And that's the most important message I think everyone should learn.
I love that. We don't quite have the billion users of Instagram, but we have a few 100,000 of downloads every month. So hopefully that'll get out to them. And the final question, Tim, is I know you're thick and heavy into the research and you're doing 1,000,001 things, but what are you most excited about right now? You mentioned a few things that got you excited in the past, that got you inspired and lit up in the past based on the studies, based on what you were finding. But currently, it might be to do with the book, it might be to do with something media related, it might be to do with research, totally up to you in terms of what direction you take this. But what are you most excited about right now?
I'm excited that I work with this company, Zoe, that is based in sort of Boston and London, that is doing personalized nutrition, and they're now selling kits in the US, hopefully come to UK and Ireland sometime in the next year. But what we're now seeing is that we can pinpoint particular foods that can boost key beneficial microbes in people. And this can lead to health benefits. And this work is going so fast that we're now developing actually probiotics, and as well as recommending foods that can target this. So I'm really excited about this next phase, is first having worked out what someone's gut's like, saying these are the things you need to improve on, and we've now starting to get the tools to actually make that happen. So I think that's the most exciting thing, if I can now prove that by eating these foods and by having these probiotics, we can really change your gut profile and instantly change those health parameters, whether it's your heart, your brain, your energy levels, your immune system, whatever it is. That to me is incredibly exciting and gets me up early and ready to go every morning.
I love it. And again, as somebody that consumes your content, I'll be following it closely, because I think, again, I could geek out on gut stuff all day. Don't have anyone near the level of expertise, but I could listen to you talk about it all day. Tim, I love this podcast. I was dying to chat since I kind of got in touch and started consuming your content online. And I think the book is something that's going to help so many people, just breaking down all those myths, breaking down those misconceptions. And it just cuts through a lot of that noise that's out there in terms of some of the mass media that gets projected into people's heads and their misinformation that comes alongside it. So just a massive thank you from me for putting out that content. But for everybody listening, can you tell them where is the best place for them to pick up the book? Where can they follow you online, or anywhere you want to send them to now? Please give those links, and I will put them in the description for today's episode for everybody listening.
Yeah, so for the books, Spoon Fed and Diet Myth, all the usual booksellers, they're available in all formats in Ireland, UK and the US. And for finding out more about the company Zoe and personalized nutrition, you may want to get on some wait lists and things that we're running it certainly in the UK and the US. That's the website joinzoe.com. And I suggest people, if they're interested in nutrition, follow me on Instagram, and for the more scientific stuff on Twitter, and it's just Tim Spector for both. And I welcome anybody. I love talking to people who are interested in self-experimenting and finding out more about the science of food.
And for everybody listening, everything that Tim has said there, I will link in the description, so you can click straight on through wherever you listen to podcasts, and they'll also be available on briankeenfitness.com in the show notes section for today's podcast. Tim, thank you for your books. Thank you for your message. Thank you for your time. Absolutely love this conversation. Pleasure was all mine. I've been absolutely dying to do this since we set it up. So thank you so much again.
My pleasure.
So there you have it, Tim Spector on why almost everything we've been told about food is wrong. I could literally talk to Tim all day or listen to Tim all day. When it comes to gut health, gut microbiome, I completely geek out on that. So this was an absolute pleasure to be able to pick the brain of somebody who is a leading expert in their field. I'm also going to be sending out, I do this every Thursday, but for those of you who would like to get my major takeaways, I send out every Thursday my 3 takeaways from podcast episodes with expert guests. So this Thursday, into your inbox, or it'll go straight into your inbox in the newsletter. I will send you my top 3 takeaways from today's episode with Tim. So if that's something you'd like, just head over to the website, briankeenfitness.com, scroll down, pop your email into the newsletter, and you will get my takeaways every single week if that's something you're interested in. As always, if this is you're a long-time listener of the podcast and you're enjoying today's episode, be sure to take a screenshot, pop it up on your Instagram stories. You can tag Tim and myself. And if it's your first time listening and you enjoyed today's episode, hit that follow button, hit that subscribe button for episodes coming every single Monday. That's everything from this week's episode. Catch you all next week.